Good evening, everyone. Late Night Mega here, and tonight we're playing Bant Anti-Burn Control. Now, this is my modern journey, which, if you're just joining this series, I'm just kind of going through different decks that I've played in modern, some of the stories behind them, how I came to build the decks, and things that worked, things that didn't work. And so this deck came about. Uh, I'd been playing my Cruel Ultimatum control deck for quite a while, and losing almost exclusively to burn decks, and maybe some other random things that I haven't had as much experience against. But anyways, so I remember this one week, it was like a Tuesday night, or it might have been a Friday night at F&M. At this point in time, I had started playing both the Tuesday and the Friday night for Modern, kind of drifting away from standard environment. And so one week we had like 9 or 10 people there for a Tuesday night tournament, and 4 or 5 of them had burn decks or mono red goblins, and it was ridiculous. Everyone, well, they weren't upset about it, they loved burn, but everyone else was really annoyed by it. So I got annoyed to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm going home, guys, and I'm building an anti-burn control deck. They're like, oh, so you're going to run like 4 timely reinforcements and 4 heroes resolve and other just life gain spells. And I'm like, no, that is not how you build a deck. You want it to be good against burn, obviously, but of course it's called an anti-burn deck. It should be good against burn, but you want it to be able to compete against other decks. And so the card that was on my mind was this card right here, Rock's War Monk, a 3 mana 3/4 with lifelink. And it's not bad. I think it's a little bit lower powered when you get out of the realm of aggro decks in Modern. And 3/4, it kind of gets outclassed by things like Tasigur, Tarmogoyf, so you can't really depend on it in combat, and that's kind of where the downfall of this deck came in. And I'm also running Kitchen Finks, because that also gains us life. We love gaining life against burn, but against burn, put down a Rock's War Monk and just gain life a couple turns. If you can gain life off of this for a couple turns, they're pretty much done. Put down a second War Monk, they're definitely done. They can't do anything about a 3/4 life link, especially not in game 1. And you know, I mentioned that we want to be good against burn, but we also want to be good against other decks too. So that's where we have main deck spells now coming in, and spell snares, 2 of each on these, and these cards counter most of Burn's cards for a single mana. And it's just funny. There's so many times where I'm just sitting there against Burn, just daring them to do something, because I have enough counters to counter everything they're going to do or try to do in a turn or two, and we've got mana leaks in here as well. And then we have this card too, this Glittering Wish. Now, Glittering Wish was not always in this deck. In fact, this deck originally had 4 Lockstone Smiters in them. I believe I just straight swapped the Smiters out for Glittering Wishes. Smiter just kind of acting like as another beat stick. Also didn't always have Kitchen Finks in this deck, which I don't know why I made that decision. I also, at one time, I had 2 Sphinx's Revelations and 1 Batter Skull. I think if I go back to this deck, I might put those 2 back in. This deck borrows a lot from the template of the Grixis Cruel Ultimatum deck that I had, and you'll see that in the mana base as well. You also see that we have our friend the Coalition Relic back. It functions very similarly to how it does in Cruel Ultimatum. We also have this card, Celestia Charm. The original list for this deck, it ran 3 Celestia Charms. It wasn't running Coalition Relic at all. I was still running just 24 lands. But I was running 3 Celestia Charm. I bumped it down to 2. I was also running a couple of Condemns, which those are those are gone. I think those kind of made room for kitchen finks or something. But anyways, so Celestia Charm, uh, this card is, in my opinion, it's a bit underrated, but it's also a bit just not powerful enough. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, a lot of times you're going to start by using this third option. You're going to put a 2/2 White Knight creature token with Vigilance onto the battlefield. So this is kind of interesting against Burn because I can play it at the end of their turn. If I didn't need to play anything else, I can start swinging with it, and it has Vigilance, so it can also block. It can block and trade with a Goblin Guide or whatever. And even against other decks, it's nice to be able to hold up mana for like a mana leak, and then if you don't need it, drop a token into play and start harassing them with it. But I think its second mode here is what's kind of hurting it. You know, exile a creature with power 5 or greater. I mean, there are some creatures with power 5 or greater in the modern format. Gurmag Angler, Tarmogoyf can very frequently get to 5 power or more. You've got Wormcoil Engine, so you do have some decent targets for this. But in so many ways, I just wish it said power 4 or greater, because then it hits Tasigur, it hits things like Loxodon Smiter, it hits a lot more if it could just hit 4 or greater instead of having to be at that 5 level. You know, things like Tarmogoyf and just other creatures with variable power will suddenly require less power, so it'll be easier to exile them, but alas, that's not the case. So that's kind of why it got bumped down to 2, but it's still kind of an interesting card. And once in a while, you can give your Rox Warmonk or something +2/+2 and trample, just to give it a surprise little pump, gain some extra life off of it. So it has that going for it too. It's a nice little card. No one's really expecting it, but not super powerful. I did it one time, I also mentioned this here, make a Bant Draw Go deck, kind of based on the Esper Draw Go deck, and wasn't too much to it. I had Celestia Charms. I also had this card, the Advent of the Worm, 4 mana instant to get a 5/5 green Worm token with Trample, and I have mixed feelings about this card. The double green was really hard for the mana base that I was playing. So if I ever go back to that sort of Bant Drago idea, I'm going to have to do something about the double green if I go back to this card. Also, the 5/5 token, it can be a really huge play, it can be a really huge benefit, but a lot of times I found if my opponent was able to counter it or kill the token without the token being able to do anything, like block a creature or do some damage or whatever, that was really bad for the deck. That was a really big blow to the deck, especially when I go to all the effort of trying to get that double green. So I didn't play the Bant Drago for too long. That's why I don't have a video dedicated just for that. But I thought I'd mention it here because it's kind of along the same lines. And now let's talk about this Glittering Wish card. So this card lets you take a multicolored card you own from outside the game. In a tournament, that would be a card from your sideboard. Reveal it and put it into your hand. And so that lets us do all kinds of crazy things, like grabbing sideboard cards game 1. Another thing you're going to notice about our mana base. Mana base is based off of our Cruel Ultimatum deck, with 4 Flooded Strands, 3 Windswept Heaths, so we have the 7 fetch lands, excuse me, and we have 4 shocks. We got 1 Breeding Pool, 1 Hallowed Fountain, 1 Sacred Foundry, and 1 Temple Garden. I chose Sacred Foundry as the red source for this deck because it is fetchable by all of our fetches. And then we've got the 5 basics, 3 of them being islands, and we have the 8 check lands, 4 of them being... Where's Glacial Fortress? Oh, there it is. Glacial Fortress, and then a 2/2 split on Hinterland Harbor and Sun Petal Grove. So let's check out the sideboard. Sideboard, we can start wishing for in game one. We've got Wear and Tear for artifact and enchantment removal. We've got Fire Spout that we can wish for, which is kind of just a cute trick for Supreme Verdict. If you ever need to go turn 2 wish into a Fire Spout to get a turn 3 sweeper, that's an option too. Otherwise, that could just be a third Supreme Verdict. Fraction Gust. This card is really amusing against Affinity and Boggles. Casting it and having it resolve will just basically win you the game. It's quite silly. And then, of course, we have some alternate finishers in the sideboard. We have Keranos because we're splashing red, so why not throw Keranos in here? Keranos is a pretty solid card. And a card that I've been surprised by is Dragonlord Dromoka. I'm going to come back to Dragonlord Dromoka. We've got Realm Razor as well. This can be a very interesting card. I originally got this card mainly for Tron, but sometimes I get into a situation where I'm like, well, I'm going to wish for a finisher, and, well, I have the mana to play Realm Razor. My opponent doesn't have much on the field. They're kind of tapped out, and exiling all lands can just kind of, win me the game over a couple turns with the Realm Razor and whatever else I got out there, and I'm all set. And so you can get some interesting situations like that. And Sagumauler, he was just there as a hexproof beat stick because I don't own Sigarda. But Dragonlord Dromoka, honestly, this is the card when I'm wishing for a finisher. This seems to be the one that I wish for the most. It has lifelink, so it comes in against any sort of aggro decks or burn decks. By the time you get around to playing this against burn, which, trust me, you will have enough time with this deck, their whole life is just going to be miserable. So flying, lifelink can't be countered, and your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. And this is also pretty relevant against a lot of other decks, especially things like Merfolk, just any aggro decks in general, control decks that can't be countered, so it can kind of harass them on that level. And I'm really surprised at how well this card has done. And yeah, and then we have the two Relic of Progenitus, and since we're splashing red, we can throw in 3 Crumble of Dust to try and deal with Tron decks as well. The original version that didn't have the red splash in it was just straight up Bant. Had some sideboard cards, very, very sort of traditional kind of stuff. Disenchant, Surgical Extraction, Detention Sphere, Relics, Verdict, Celestial Flare, and Spreading Seas as kind of a land hate card. And so this deck was alright, and I wouldn't mind going back to it. I do feel that in a lot of matchups, the Rocks Warmonk is a little bit underpowered. You can't quite get you there fast enough, and kind of easy to deal with. Eats a path or a terminate, and you just kind of feel bad about it. And that's one of the reasons I had a couple Dispels in the main deck, was also to protect these guys from instant speed removal like that. Honestly, I think if I go back to this deck, I would make room for the second Revelation and get the Batterskull back in there. Maybe cutting a couple of these War Monks, I don't know. But this might be a deck that I return to sometime in the future. It's definitely very fun to play, especially when you have the Glittering Wish in there and you can start just grabbing stuff from your sideboard. Really throws your opponent off, and it really helps. Glittering Wish really helps your game one because you're having access to sideboard cards that you wouldn't normally have access to in the first game. But also because of the Glittering Wish and everything else I'm cramming in the main deck, I didn't have room for mass removal, so I moved that to the side. But that's okay, because you can just wish for it. So yeah, against burn decks, I made burn decks really sad when I took this deck to a tournament. And I think Friday night again we had a crowd of about like 9 10 to 12 people, and 4 or 5 of them were on Burn or Goblins again, and I ended up playing against 2 of those guys, and this deck just utterly wrecked them. Like, I'm sitting there turn 4, still at around, hovering around the 15 life mark. I've got counter spells in hand. I'm playing a Rox War Monk with like a Dispel backup or something, and it was just silly. It wasn't good for them, but I had a good time. Uh, so this is the Bant anti-burn control. What other stories do I have against this? Oh, Texas deck is kind of weak against probably, like, the more dedicated control decks I really struggled dealing with. Again, mainly because Rox War Monk is just kind of a beat stick against them, and they're playing a deck that has tons of removal. And Celestia Charm. Celestia Charm, you put out the 2/2 Knight token. It'll harass them for a little bit, but it's ultimately going to be underwhelming in those matchups as well against various control. So your best hope against them is to get a Wish resolved for like a Keranos or a Dromoka or something. Another thing that this deck is kind of lacking is in the card draw department and the card filtering department. You can't filter through your cards as quickly as some of the other decks that you've seen, and I think that's one of the things that kind of holds this deck down as well. And I'll be touching more on that topic more towards when we get, well, I don't want to say near the end of this series, but near to the current time frame of what I'm playing now and what I'm working on now, sort of stuff. I'm going to come back and do a little bit of a comparison between like this deck and what I'd call my trifecta of successful modern decks. Not that this one didn't have its success. I mean, it had its share of success, but it's not up there on the level of Cruel Ultimatum or my Blue-White Shadow of Doubt deck, where I can just grab it, go to an FNM, and be pretty sure that I'm going to walk away in some sort of with some sort of prize support. Can't really do that with this deck. Not to say this deck hasn't won prizes, but it hasn't been as consistent as my other top decks. And so I'm still kind of looking for another deck to kind of break into that area. And we'll be getting to the third member of the trifecta soon, but actually next time we're going to go a little bit on a different path and play a deck that doesn't have Snapcaster Mage. In fact, a deck that doesn't have blue at all. It'll be more of an aggro control deck based on a Legacy Mono Black deck that I ran back in like 2009. And, well, that deck will have some weird stuff in it. You're going to see some really weird choices coming up. And also this card, Glittering Wish, it will be back.